Okay. Hello, everyone. Just waiting maybe 30 more seconds for everyone to join in. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel on the topic of risk and reputation management in the carbon markets. I'm Julian Jacob. I'll be moderating this panel. I work at Puro Earth. We're a standard and registry celebrating our 5th anniversary this spring. And Puro Earth specializes in durable carbon removal. So that stretches from biochar, BECCS, DACs, geologically stored carbon, enhanced rock weathering. To introduce the webinar today, I will say that the voluntary carbon market offers readily actionable solutions for corporates who want to have an impact on carbon emissions. And this makes it an extremely powerful tool to mobilize the capital we need to deliver our global net zero strategy. Recent years have seen the ecosystem deploy great efforts, striving for higher integrity across the board, and also converging on a definition of what constitutes high-quality carbon credits. But recent years have also seen crisis in the voluntary carbon markets, and that has shown that not all credits were created equal, and that a carbon project being later found to be invalid could cause both reputational and financial harm to corporates. Today's group of experts work alongside one another to help corporates meet those challenges and address those challenges and ensure that investments continue to flow to the high quality carbon projects that deliver the actual impact. They're invited today to bring their expert views on carbon credit crisis, how to prepare for it, how to respond to it, and how to recover from it. So I'm pleased to introduce our 3 panelists, starting with Natalia Dorfman, CEO and co-founder of KIDA, a carbon insurance specialist. Natalia will make the case for dedicated insurance that demonstrates upfront due diligence and risk mitigation and protect against financial loss and safeguard climate commitments. Thank you, Natalia, for joining. Narda Shirley, who's a co-founder of communication agency, The Willful Group. Narda will tackle crisis response readiness and reputational recovery from a PR or public relation perspective. Thank you, Narda. And Nigel Brook, who leads Clyde & Co's global resilience and climate change risk practice. He will address how proactive legal advice can help companies set up for success. Maybe to kick things off, I will ask Natalia to set the scene and elaborate a bit around the risks we're discussing here.
Thank you. And it's great to be here. So I'm supposed to set the scene on the risks, but also on the wider readiness framework. I'm just going to start slightly wider than KITA and even wider than insurance. So my prior career, I worked at Clyde & Co actually, so alongside Nigel for 8+ years. And I learned a lot from that experience in terms of what I think of as this readiness point. So Clyde & Co is an international law firm, a lot of insurance business there, as well as working with commodities, energy, shipping, aviation, construction type companies. And I remember one thing that Nigel used to always say when we worked with companies in the climate space was, and this was often working with the directors of companies, and Nigel, sorry, you can correct me if any of this is wrong, but it was, imagine yourself in a courtroom in 5 years' time, and you're being questioned about the decisions that you made today, right? Something has gone wrong, and often things do go wrong. But what you need to be able to evidence is that based on the information you had available to you today, did you do everything you possibly could in terms of that due diligence and governance to put in place the mechanisms to mitigate that risk and protect yourself and recover if that risk were to occur? And I think about that a lot in the carbon markets, and I think that's very much where legal advice, definitely insurance, definitely proactive communication strategies can really help you to show that due diligence, as well as working with companies like Puro and ratings agencies and MRB, et cetera. The second point that I wanted to make here as a framing is an analogy from another industry. So a lot of you will be aware of potentially cyber insurance, but in essence, cyber insurance is another new insurance industry that came out of a new risk, which was identified when companies started having a lot of more data. And that data was in the cloud and it started to get stolen. And initially, people didn't recognize this as a risk. And then at some point, companies realized that if they had a data breach, some kind of cyber hack, it actually caused them a lot of reputational damage, as well as increasingly financial loss. And what we saw at Clyde & Co., and again, Nigel much more than I, saw legal practices spring up to help companies alongside crisis PR to be prepared at the start, pre-plan what they would do in the instance of a cyber attack, so that when that attack happened, they could immediately respond with their communication strategy, their legal guidance, and you often saw insurance sitting behind it as that further risk mitigation and recovery mechanism if that risk were to occur. And so I suppose just to summarize quickly from the Kita view, obviously we are a specialist carbon insurance company and we see risks across the carbon markets. I think those range, as you will know, from delivery to invalidation to reversal to fraud. And I'm often of the view that this is a market inherently with risk. Those risks will at times take place. And the best thing you can do is to be prepared. And so from the insurance view, we see ourselves as almost like a consultant who gives you advice, helps you do the due diligence, helps you to look at the contracts that you've set up and see if the risk is being shared in appropriate ways, if there's a way that risk could be shared with an insurance company. But in addition to just giving you that advice, we also stand behind it because if there is a loss, the insurance company comes in to help you recover in the point of a claim. And so from that perspective, I do very much see insurance as a core part of this readiness framework. And also, I know when we were preparing for this, we talked about governance. I see it very much as part of the governance strategy. When companies are looking at their risks, once they're able to quantify those risks, you look at how do you mitigate them. And insurance was one of the core tools that we have in many industries in order to do that.
Thank you very much, Natalia. So mitigating risk through insurance, definitely. Nigel, maybe I can pass it on to you now and hear about legal construct as a risk mitigation as well.
Yep. So climb on to what Natalia was saying then, just taking this perspective of the deal that's gone wrong, looking back, the kind of inquest, and asking yourself, could we have done better here? And taking the absolutely realistic view that projects can and will go wrong regardless of any steps you take. You can't manage this risk completely away. So going back to the beginning, of course, due diligence is the key part. Have you actually surfaced all the risks? I think that just pausing there and take this future view, it's no good applying just the usual checklist, because that checklist will evolve over time. There'll be risks that become apparent. The latest science, geopolitics moves on, and so on. So there are risks about the country, about the project itself, about the counterparty, which don't lend themselves to being reduced to a fixed bullet point list of things. You need to be proactive. If you've decided through having conducted due diligence, this is a project in principle you want to do, then it's about risk allocation. The risk is identified. Some of them you can insure, some of them potentially you could allocate through the contract, but again, being mindful, of course, the contractual remedies you have are only as strong as the counterparty and their ability to actually deliver if things do go wrong in an expected way. And do you want security? Is that available? Have you identified all the key obligations? Have you instructed the contract in a way that lends itself to insurance, makes it insurance friendly? And again, that's an insurer like Kita, I'm sure, can help with that. That there are ways you perhaps could crystallize certain parts of the risk so that they become more readily insurable. Political risk as well, if there's permissions being given to the counterparty, are they in a crisp, clear way that could lend itself to political risk insurance if that's appropriate? So there's a lot of key due diligence, and which then gives rise to efforts, the best efforts you can in the circumstances to mitigate, or to reallocate or transfer these risks. The idea being that if something does go wrong, you're on the right side of the line, that you're not at fault. Nobody can say, why didn't you see this coming? Why didn't you deal with it? And of course, just to emphasize the reputational risk, that this is, as you said in your introduction, Julian, a contested area now. There are some strong views about carbon credits per se and about the quality of certain of them. And NGOs in particular seem to have strong views and do indulge in litigation about them. But also now they're coming under reporting obligations under CSRD and so on. So you'll be forced to say things about them. And you don't want those statements to be falsified, or if they are falsified, you want to be able to say, but it wasn't my fault. These things happen. So yeah, a number of steps to be taken at that stage.
Thank you very much. So very much into showing that a lot of care has been given at the onset about what could happen. Narda, maybe could you also elaborate a bit about what can be thought of on the onset, from the onset around public relations?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Julian. So I think, going back to the beginning, what constitutes a threat to reputation in this situation? And I think a lot of that is going to be really dependent on your business and your service and how much kind of carbon neutrality or guilt-free consumption has been baked into your proposition. Have you been communicating previously about the fact that you're a really good supply chain partner because of your really good carbon neutrality, for example? So it's going to be different depending on whether you're on the buy side, the sell side, or whether you're kind of around in the ecosystem somewhere. But in terms of what does that reputational threat really entail? It usually always comes down to I suppose trust in the business, in the brand going forward. Can your stakeholders, and that might be customers, it might be, to Nigel's point, it might be pressure coming in from different investors around your transition plans and what those are looking like. There are lots of different people now looking at this area. So having, first of all, kind of considered, how big a risk something is when it pops up based on your own situation. The readiness part really is to think about the risk in terms of any other. This is a risk to potentially the value of your brand, to the value of your company, potentially depending on where you sit in the ecosystem, to its continuity. So, in the same way as when the building catches on fire, we need drills for that. It's like any other business risk, really. And good crisis communication preparedness involves surfacing those risks. So kind of having really good, really robust, really well understood processes and procedures in place in terms of, doing the scenario planning and gathering all the information so that if something does kick off, you're not wasting time running around trying to find out the facts. These are all things that you can have ready and, kind of almost kind of 80% there in terms of being able to understand the situation. The other thing that I think is worth saying is, as well as kind of preparing the facts and the stats and the data points, you need to prepare the people. So very often in a crisis, the best way to respond is to actually put a human being out there rather than only a statement or something that's written, because people are much better at rebuilding trust or, kind of at least asking for forgiveness in certain situations, depending on how deep a crisis it is. So knowing who it is, kind of in your company, in your ecosystem, among your suppliers as well. Natalia made a very good point when we were preparing for this, which is, many of the actors in this ecosystem can be quite young in terms of their company age and potentially quite unsophisticated and might not have been in a situation like this before. So, know who those people are, be in contact with them, don't be looking for them in the time of crisis. Make sure you've got phone numbers, you've got names, and make sure that everything is accurate. These things all sound really obvious, but you'd be amazed how many times in a crisis it just hasn't been done. It's work that hasn't been done. And going back to this idea that this is really just good governance, this is just basic good housekeeping that should be there as part of your business risk. And then just finally, I just wanted to touch on the fact that this is a very international marketplace, and it may well be that the crisis isn't only going to affect you in one market. I'm thinking about things that happened last year, big stories, and there was a very much a kind of a dual focus between the Northern Hemisphere and kind of East Africa, and localization is going to be an issue there. You might have to think about having different teams in different markets handling communications for different stakeholder groups in different places, and it can get quite complex quite quickly. So, the more work you can do up front, the better, basically, just to make sure that you're optimizing the time that you've got available. And then the final point is, don't do this work once, stick it in a folder, put it on a shelf and wait for it to gather dust. This is a really fast moving marketplace. It's hugely dynamic. Things are changing rapidly. If you are going to think about this from a reputation risk perspective, please do it regularly. Get that binder off the shelf, check those phone numbers, think about, what your exposure looks like, and just update it so that everybody knows what the starting point is if things do go a little bit awry.
Thanks. So yeah, don't hide from risk. Actually, assess it properly, document it, prepare for it, and continuously update those processes and involve people. That's really important. So now that we better understand what are the risks and how to prepare for it as part of a robust risk strategy, maybe we could now touch upon what happens if the worst actually comes to pass. What happens then? And maybe we can again start with you, Natalia, on this topic.
Yeah, of course. So from the insurance perspective, at this stage, it is something bad has happened. And we're going to obviously work on the assumption that you've been insured for this bad thing. And so we touched on some of the things you could be insured for, but it is your it could be the big things like the delivery risk, the reversal, the invalidation, the political risk. But often it will be one sub thing within that. Let's say there has been a fraudulent action by a counterparty that has led to a loss. And so I think insurance actually at this stage is helpful in multiple facets. The key one obviously being paying the insurance claim. But even before that, I think it can be helpful. So if you think about what we would do, because a lot of the policies and projects that we work with are multi-year. And so it is not in Kita's best interest to sell you an insurance policy and then forget about your project. It is actually very much in our best interest to continue monitoring the project throughout that life so that we know if we think there's any problems happening. And so from our own kind of financial management perspective, it's called putting something on the wobble list. But if you see a project might have a problem that you might end up paying a claim, you want to know about it so you can start to monitor that and make sure you're prepared for that claim. So one, the assessment throughout, I think, is helpful because if we see a problem, we could feasibly alert our client to it. Second, with insurance in the carbon markets, I think we have very aligned interests with our clients. I think broadly speaking, we are working with people and we try and set up our contracts such that it is in everyone's best interest for this project to perform as planned and to deliver the carbon credits. And I think we all know that because of supply constraints and fungibility challenges in the market, if you bought from a specific project, you really want those credits. And you could get replacement credits, but they might not be exactly what you wanted. So we're all working together for the same outcome, which I think makes what we would call the waiting period really helpful. So what we would normally expect to see is our client comes to us with what they think is a loss. So for example, the third-party audit has come back and there's been a less carbon credits delivered than they thought. But there might be a time frame in which we might be able to fix the problem via the terms of the contract that they've signed with their counterparty. It could be replacement credits, it could be agreed period of delay, what have you. And we will work with our client during that waiting period to try and come out with the best outcome for all of us, which is actually this project actually is functional. Of course, then if that is not possible, that is where the core of insurance comes in. The response is paying the insurance claim. And how the claim is paid, and by which I mean if it's paid in cash or if it's paid in replacement carbon credits, is really goes back to that readiness stage with the client and working with them to make sure they understand what they're safeguarding. So are they, for example, safeguarding their financial interest in this project because they wanted to free up space on their balance sheet to be able to deploy that capital elsewhere? And thus the insurance claim is really, in essence, plugging the hole in their balance sheet. Or was it that they really want to safeguard that climate commitment? And you know what? They bought carbon credits because they need carbon credits and they need to make good against their net zero commitments. And thus they want the carbon credits to be provided as the replacement. It's determining that in the readiness phase. So at this response phase, the insurance claim is paying out directly towards what the outcome you needed to secure is. But yeah, I think insurance is key in the response, definitely.
Thanks a lot. And on the legal side, if the worst has come to pass, what are the next steps to undertake?
Okay, I think taking immediate legal advice is a sound idea. Maybe even to help you to work out. I would say that, wouldn't I? But it's true, to work out possibly what's gone wrong as well. One incidental point on this is that within bounds, the legal advice will attract legal privilege, and that might be useful if there's a later dispute. If you're at this early stage trying to work out what went wrong, you would, once you've identified what potentially was the problem, then you would want to check contract terms and see if there's any rights of recourse against the counterparty. Has there been a breach? Are there any remedies? And if so, what should be done now to either pursue them or to preserve them? You may want to preserve them while you take other actions. And also considering if you are thinking about enforcing some sort of remedy, does the counterparty actually have enough assets to perform that? That would be crucial. And then also consider the implications of this failure of the carbon credit, depending on what exactly has gone wrong. Has it been voided? Is it less valuable than you expect, and so on? What are the implications for the company directly, but also in terms of reporting? You've reported this. Do you need now to, how quickly do you need to correct the record? How urgently do you need perhaps to seek a substitute credit? And again, this is picking up on a point Nada's made. It's really good to think ahead and not wait until the bad thing happens. What you want a lawyer on speed dial, so that, or several firms perhaps, depending, so that you can immediately get advice. Time might be of the essence depending on what's gone wrong, and some proactivity in advance, some planning in this regard, including the legal side, could help a great deal. It could, for example, influence the way the messaging, if there's publicity about this and reputational damage, and you're thinking about the messaging around this and how to frame it. Again, legal advice could be very helpful because you don't know what will be the longer term legal consequences of this going wrong.
Thanks a lot. I think you made the analogy, Narda, about the fire drill earlier. So now this fire drill is flashing red. What are the next steps from a PR perspective?
Well, I think you fed me that line brilliantly. Thank you. Because what I'm going to say is, you know, if the building's on fire, you call the fire brigade, right? You don't try and put it out on your own with a bucket. And I think the one thing about crisis situations, and I'm talking about real crisis situations now, and I hope no one on this call ever finds themselves in one, because they're tough, right? But as a general rule, in my experience, they always last longer and do more damage and suck up more resources than you ever think they will at the beginning when they first pop up their ugly heads. So I would say, in terms of your response, make sure that you have in place mechanisms to escalate really quickly, and don't silo the response. Don't think that this is just a comms issue. To Nigel's point, have your lawyer on speed dial, have your insurer there, just get everybody in the room, and also within the business, because this isn't only going to be something that comms can fix alone. It's very often the case that you do need to get the leadership team some visibility of what's going on very, very quickly. So make sure that you can really get to those people that you need to in order to figure out what your response is going to be. And the other thing to say is that very often, it's a media phone call on a Friday when they give you no time to actually, get a response together, that usually sets the alarm bells ringing. Oh my goodness, the story is going to go out there. What are we going to say? What are we going to say? And you're on the back foot immediately. And that's a horrible feeling, unless you've done, lots of anticipation. And then at least that you can get your procedure down and kind of go through it. But the other thing that I would advise is that, whilst dealing with the media feels like the thing that you have to do, and you have to do that well, and you have to make sure that it's, kind of been like really properly signed off on and considered, don't forget your other stakeholders, because the media is, by its very nature, it has an agenda, and it's always going to, whatever you give to them, it's going to be filtered in the way it then appears. So don't put all of your eggs into the media response basket. I would say take control of your other stakeholder communications immediately. So let your customers know what's going on if the situation warrants it. Make sure that you open up those channels that you own and control, and start putting content in them to let people know what's going on. That's the one very important thing, is just make sure that it's easy for you to do that and turn those on really quickly if you need to, because that's where you control completely the content and the frequency of the communication. The other thing to say, and this is always the last thing that people think about, is don't forget the staff. If you're in a big organization and something big is going down, make sure that you take the time to tell your own people inside of the organization what's going on, because actually, if they don't know, if they don't feel trusted, if they feel like they're being kept in the dark, then you're missing a huge opportunity to turn the people who can be the biggest defenders of your brand and the biggest advocates from the inside. Give them the tools, let them know what the kind of the right messages are that have been formulated. Make it really clear who's talking to media and who's not talking to media, and also what the social media policies are as well. I mean, again, this all sounds like it's really obvious, but it's a lot to think about when you're actually trying to deal with the crisis as it's unfolding. So again, just having really good preparations ready means that you can go through and just do this really methodically. And just a comment on, again, depending on the depth and the scale of the crisis, if you can't get all the facts straight away in order to formulate a response, if situations are fast moving and unfolding and you're just really trying to buy a little bit of time, statements, whilst not perfect, can prevent this kind of very undesirable kind of no comment situation where the media can say that you are unavailable for comment, because that always looks like you've got something to hide and you are shifty. So much better to have something to buy you a little bit of time while you can formulate a better response. And usually that means, getting a real person out there to talk to media. And then the last point on kind of responding, because there will be lots of different ways in which it's appropriate to respond depending on the particular crisis. So I'm not going to try and give you, the whole gauntlet of what you could be doing or what you should be doing, because it's impossible to do it without knowing the details. But one thing that's really true is that when you're in a crisis situation, you are by definition on the back foot. And you can do everything, and you should do everything to, come up with the facts and, set the record straight and kind of refute that crisis, deflect it as much as you can, protect your brand. But you are always going to be playing defense. And, the really important thing here is, if possible, to try to change the narrative as quickly as you possibly can. And that's that's a big ask when you're in a crisis, especially if it's a deep one. But being able to step back and think about where you can take the attention next, is the ultimate thing to be able to do. And in this context, it's also about contextualization and thinking about the bigger picture, which again is something which takes a lot of steady nerve if you're feeling under attack. So, again, that's one of the reasons for getting some outside perspective on what's going on, because it can be quite calming and quite helpful to have people to help steer the ship when things feel like you're in a big storm. So that's that.
Thanks. Very practical pieces of advice there. So thanks a lot for that. But also echoing what you said at the beginning, do get in touch with your lawyers and do get in touch with the professionals at that point in time. So when you've navigated that crisis, obviously you're going to continue engaging within this broader activities, because this is a market that we do need. And what lessons maybe can be learned from own experience of corporates or from others to then incorporate them into a strategy going forward? And maybe I will again here start with you, Natalia. What can be incorporated into new strategies? What are the downsides also that will need to be addressed going forward?
Yeah, of course. So this is now post your response. We're getting into your recovery kind of stage. And so I suppose the key thing here is, I think you actually probably segment it, is either were you that entity, maybe not you personally, but your company, if they were the ones at fault, then you have a different way of recovery versus if you were not at fault, but you were harmed. So let's say, for example, I am a corporate who purchased from a carbon project that was later found to have a problem, but my name has been put into the press. I think you have slightly different recovery tactics here. But from the insurance perspective, I think where insurance really can help is with messaging. So again, going back even to that readiness point, if at the readiness point, insurance is part of the messaging to demonstrate how you've done all the due diligence and safeguards you possibly could based on the information you had available today, it's sort of the same thing if in the recovery stage. It is again saying, okay, well, now actually one of those risks that I had identified has happened. And insurance can be part of that messaging again to say, well, actually, we are now further identifying those risks and further looking how to mitigate them. And one of those ways is insurance. And I'm not going to get into it. I'm happy to answer this in questions. We often get asked about reputational risk insurance specifically, which I think has some challenges, but I think insurance can be part of your messaging regardless almost of the type. It's demonstrating how you're looking forward and how that now that you have identified a risk and maybe multiple risks, you're looking how to manage them. I suppose just a couple key points to make here. So we do get this sometimes when people come to us once they know they have a problem. Maybe the problem hasn't gone public yet, but they know they have a problem. I would say, just like you wouldn't buy health insurance right after you've been diagnosed with cancer, what ideally you want to do is get insurance early prior to those problems being diagnosed, because it might increase your insurance premium. Like it might not, because you might now be looking for insurance for the rest of your portfolio, which is fully segmented from the project in question. But I would again say the more that you can prepare in advance to engage with insurance, the better. And then I guess the final point that I would make here, which is about recovery, but just also a bit more widely, I think one of the challenges right now within the voluntary carbon market is that we all know there might be losses and we all definitely know there's risks, but it's very hard to quantify the exact value of that future loss, and which can make it seem sort of that unquantifiable risk, which I think sometimes people ignore. And so one way that you can think about insurance, in particular at this recovery phase, maybe now once you've been faced with that loss, it's swapping out that uncertainty of a future loss for the certainty of an upfront insurance premium. And once you think about it in that way, and particularly if you work with your legal advisors or your crisis PR advisors to better be able to quantify the value of a future loss, you're able to make more of an educated financial decision as to whether or not the insurance makes sense for you, given your process of engaging with the market, margins you're looking to make, outcomes you're looking to have. But very much in this recovery phase, I would suggest, again, re-looking at insurance to make sure that it is covering the risks that are key to you. And I would say probably overall, all of the parties on this call, it's important in any kind of recovery to have partners in your corner who very much have your best interests as their best interests. So again, I think that reference is making sure that you have those lawyers and those PR teams available to you, because depending on the party and how you were damaged, you might have a long road back. But like you said, that doesn't mean that you're going to stop engaging with the market. I would imagine most people will need to continue to engage with the market to do at the high level point of what we need to fight the climate change crisis.
Thank you. Nigel, any thoughts on what you would advise to your clients who've just come out of a crisis and want to build maybe better, especially on the legal side?
Yeah, I think you could call it an inquest if you like, but an internal inquiry, a really honest, objective as possible view of the various stages. So at the very beginning, are there things we could have done better at the initial stage? Do we do our due diligence properly? Is this a project that actually, in retrospect, we should have backed? Are there signals we should have picked up here that might have alerted them to the fact this could be problematic? Are there terms we might have put in the contract if we'd known what could go wrong? Would we have been in a better place today if we'd done that? And these are really good lessons for next time. Just re-emphasizing the point I made earlier that this is always a moving target, and you can't reduce this to a standard checklist. That this could add to your checklist for future projects. And then also looking at when the crisis blew up, again, were there things that you do differently if you had your time again? Did you move fast enough? Did you engage stakeholders quickly enough? Did you engage the counterparty and your investors and possibly the regulator early enough and in a proactive enough way? And I think this is unlikely at this stage, but possible, you could have a third party zooming in, an NGO, for example, and trying to make something of it that a carbon credit has gone wrong. Again, are there things you could have done to head them off or to make them look at it, go away and focus on something else? To perhaps just persuade them straight away that this really isn't something that they need to that has legs. And this also, have you, in terms of reporting, does it have any implications for the way you rely on or report on carbon credits, or more still, publicize them? Have you made a virtue in a wider to a wider audience about having carbon credits, or made claims on the back of them which are now falsified? Again, would you reflect on that? Would you perhaps reframe the way that you put these things? I think framing is so important. There are ways and ways of putting something, some of which can be attacked and others are much more defensible, as long as they're framed properly. We've seen, for example, a legal case about things being called carbon neutral. In fact, even in the KLM judgment in the Netherlands last month, we saw criticism of claims the airline had made based on carbon credits, because they were pretending, or it was deemed they were pretending that the emissions from the flights could be exactly matched off against the carbon credits. Framing is so important. So there's always, I think, things to be learned. There's always a teachable moment of crisis.
Thank you very much. Narda, on the PR side, so you've come out of a crisis and now you have a bit more time to reflect and think of how to do things better and how to also probably have follow-up actions in a less stressed or a quick manner. Can you elaborate a bit on what this could look like from your perspective?
Sure. I mean, there's an adage in the industry which is never waste a good crisis. And I think, what that means is that in a situation like this, which is likely to be a situation which has been inherently about trust, trust from different groups about whether or not what you've said is actually true, or whether it was a bit fudgy, and whether it came out in the wash as being not really good enough. And you've got a situation in which you can really walk the walk. And in terms of how you respond is almost as important as what you say. And if you are a purposeful organization, and if you're an organization that has very strong values and behaviors, then how you respond should be really kind of synchronous with that, so that you're reinforcing the fact that you'll be kind of super transparent about it, for example, in how you deal with the crisis. And I think because of the complexity, I mean, let's face it, I was just reading last week, I think it was the Telegraph last week, where that this subject has moved mainstream when a journalist is writing about the fact that a big kind of global pop star, Taylor Swift, is flying to the Super Bowl, and Elton John is being criticised for offsetting her carbon emissions, and it's only cost him $50. That the genie is forever out of the bottle, and that is the way that this industry is being reported, right? So I think what we have to accept is that there is a huge amount of education still to be done. This is a really complex, a really technical subject, and it would benefit enormously from greater accessibility and in a way for people to be able to understand the difference between the different types of kind of methodologies in the voluntary carbon market. So that's the first thing, is take the opportunity, if you are rebuilding, to educate. I think it's really important. Contextualize and educate, and kind of talk about everything that you're doing and why, because I think the why gets lost a lot in the how in a lot of these conversations. And then, try and be proactive. I mean, it can feel like the last thing anyone wants to do after a crisis. Everyone just wants to run and hide and have a rest. But actually just, kind of try and get out on the front foot, and go back to those stakeholders and just almost, really make sure that you're landing the messages about the fact that things may not be resolved, because very rarely are things tidy enough to ever be called, properly resolved. But the experience of what you've been through will have created opportunities for the organisation to learn. To Nigel's point about, did we do it well enough? Are there things that we can now bake into our procedures going forward? So just be really clear about that. What good things came out of this bad situation? So transparency, if you can bear it, is always a really good thing. And avoiding jargon wherever possible, because it just immediately feels very exclusive, and like this is stuff that happens in a corner where only a few people understand it, and that makes it even more difficult to trust what's going on if it's not clear. And then in terms of how to change the narrative, which is what we were talking about a little bit before, it's often a good idea to potentially think about some thought leadership or some research or something which is going to be really helpful and factual in moving the conversation forward, rather than always looking backward. And I think, working or being really clear about how you're contributing to the wider reputation of the industry by working with industry bodies, trade associations, getting involved in consultations, working with influencers. All of this stuff is really important, actually, in just pulling together as an industry and moving the conversation on. And once the crisis is over, taking time to go back to those journalists and maybe briefing them in background and making sure that they really understand. what's going on in the market, so that you're kind of getting some goodwill in the bank, so that if anything does go wrong in the future, they're starting from a position of greater understanding. Because often, again, it's really hard in a crisis to get people to spend the time to understand something if it feels really technical and hard. They're always going to go to the path of least resistance. And then finally, I think this is a really hard thing to say, but don't assume that it's only ever going to happen once and it'll never happen again. That seems really, really mean. But even if you've come through something relatively well, it doesn't mean that you're never going to be in the firing line again. So it's really important to take a breath and go back and just make sure that all the learnings are being captured and turned into better, stronger procedures going forward. So I think that's it from me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the discussion so far, all three of you. So we have a bit less than 10 minutes for a Q&A session. I will encourage everyone in the call to share their questions in the Q&A. We will be asking them to our panelists. I saw also someone had their hand risen a couple of minutes ago. So if you if you want to direct your question directly to the chat, that would be great. Okay, so we have a question first for Natalia. Does Kita cover risks for project developers running projects in relatively unstable countries?
I say a lot of the countries, so yes to the countries. I mean, a lot of the countries that we see in the carbon markets, I suppose I wouldn't call them necessarily unstable, but we do work with a range of countries. So yes, on that basis. In terms of the project developers, actually, we have historically worked more closely with the investors, but we're actually right now working on translating that project to project developers. So I'd say developers can very much get in touch. And I suppose I very much see one of the ethos of Kita has always been around how do we help to remove and reduce risk, and then also help make sure the risk is sitting with the best party. And I think often what I see in the carbon markets is the project developers sitting with a lot of risk, and sometimes they're not necessarily the best place to handle that risk. And so I think insurance can play a role here, definitely. So yeah, so please get in touch.
Very good. I can tell if I'm not seeing the other questions or, oh, sorry. Okay. So another question is, so it's like, oh, okay, that's a long one. Shouldn't companies be acquiring high integrity credits which ensure additionality and permanence of carbon capture and storage so as to avoid crisis? And are not crisis in carbon neutralization the result of oil quality credits? So that's very much a question around selecting at first the high integrity carbon credits. Who would like to maybe tackle this one? Nigel.
Yeah, I have an opinion too. I'll go after Nigel.
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's a great idea, and it's actually would be good for the market if people did aim high, go for high quality credits. That's good for everyone, but it doesn't completely sidestep all issues. It could be high quality intrinsically, but things can still go wrong. There could be a change of government in the country concerned, political risk. It could be wiped out by a freak weather event. There's a number of, no matter how good it is on paper, there are things that can still go wrong. And so this is where the steps we've been talking about of insurance, contract terms, due diligence really come to the fore. Have you got a good handle on all of the risk, not just the inherent qualities of the project, though that's crucially important, critically important, but anything else that potentially could go wrong that have nothing to do with the quality of the project per se?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, actually. And we get this a lot. I think most people maybe not, but everyone that's come to us is very much looking to buy and engage or build the highest quality they possibly can, and looking at all the mechanisms they can put in place to ensure the quality. But a quality project can still have a problem, just like Nigel mentioned. And I think it's common language in the market to look at your avoidable risks and your unavoidable risks. And your avoidable risks, fine, you know, to the extent, let's say if I'm a project developer, an avoidable risk would be being fraudulent. But there are many risks outside the control of any counterparty, such as those government-related risks, and such as, of course, natural catastrophe risks, which are unfortunately on the rise. So I think of them as separate things. You want quality, but you also have to look at the things that could go wrong, even with the highest quality project.
Thank you. So I think we have a follow-up question, which is, well, not different topic, sorry. What constitutes as a crisis to require this level of preparation? When does one negative mention in press, for example, become a question of reputational and financial damage? So I think this one maybe it would be one for you, Narda.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is how closely your brand or your business has aligned itself with, you know, its strategies to, you know, remove its carbon or to abate its carbon footprint. So one mention, you know, absolutely doesn't feel like it needs to get the, you know, the freight train rolling in terms of crisis management, reputational crisis management. But I think it's important to monitor and to know and to be able to see, because I think sometimes, you know, these things actually will roll for a while. And, you know, the first story might not create too many waves, but it's very often the case that stories kind of unfold and then they gather momentum. And very soon, if your eye isn't on the ball, what could feel like it wasn't really a big deal last week is suddenly a huge deal. And actually, you know, if you're kind of tracking and kind of making sure that you're ready, you're much less likely to be caught off guard. So I think if you're feeling in any way that this is something that is core to your business proposition, then monitor it and just keep abreast of what's going on in the media and just the general discussion out there.
It's the snowball at the top of the hill, isn't it?
Yeah.
You want to perhaps catch it at that end rather than the 6-foot ball at the bottom end.
Yes, when it rolls over you.
Thank you. So we have another question here about risk assessment. So this one is really very much for Kita, it seems. And Talia, how does risk assessment and providing quotes work? Does Kita invest resources and time into the DD, due diligence and risk assessment of a project without any commitment of the project advancing with the insurance of interest?
Yeah, of course. So that depends on the stage of the project. So for a lot of projects where there is information available and they're already at a stage where I'd say they're more executing rather than building, then yes, you can come to us and give us high level information on the project, and we can provide you back a pretty high level quote very quickly. Often within 24 hours. And then if that initial quote is suitable for you, then we will ask for more due diligence on the project. We need to see your contractual terms, for example, and then that can lead to a final quote and the binding of an insurance policy. And I'm happy to talk through with anyone in interest if they want to know more details as to the types of things we look at. We do, however, and increasingly so, are doing more upfront risk advisory services as well. And so this led out of projects coming to us all the time when they were at a very early stage. And so people on this call will know there are many projects just getting off the ground today, but they're at a stage where I'd say they might be too early for insurance. But they still want to know, how do I build a project that is insurable, that is bankable, that has the appropriate data availability and risk mitigation mechanisms built in. And so we have started doing more risk advisory services for these projects such that they can build and get to the point where they are insurable, which I'd say is often going to be within a 12-month or so period. So we have what I think is a pretty cost-effective service upfront to do that. And then likewise, we've increasingly be getting, going back to our original sort of readiness framework, queries from buyers who say maybe right now they don't need insurance because the actual overall cost of their business isn't that high. But what they would like to know is actually the probability of loss, the likelihood of loss across the subtypes of projects, and where the risks sort of might be most key that leads to those losses, just so they can be aware and plan their buying strategy accordingly. And again, whether Kita or other sort of providers, I think that risk advisory service is increasingly important to help people in that readiness framework.
Thanks a lot. So next question, on the media, often publicizing false statements on projects or scientific research. How can businesses and project developers with Let's Reach correct or clear those issues? And I'm guessing maybe Narda, you would want to take this one, or Nigel.
Well, I'll take a shot at it, but Nigel, please do jump in. I mean, I think it's very difficult unless it's something, you know, we're into kind of, I suppose, factual inaccuracy is the realm of now. So if you're reading an article and you see something which you think, well, actually, that's just plain wrong, the usual recourse is to you know, if it's not about you, but if you're in the industry, is to write a letter to the editor, and actually just, you know, stand up as an expert and offer clarification. And the way to do that well is to be really quick. And actually, publications love that because it's showing that they have engagement, that they have an audience, that people are reading what they're writing, and very often they're very, you know, they're very happy to publish a view that's coming from an expert within the industry. You know, if it's something that is much closer to home and you feel that you've been misrepresented, then, you know, very often it's absolutely the case that you should contact the journalist and ask for a clarification to be printed. But I think those are two quite different scenarios, and I think I know what this question might be about, and I think it might be about some research which was published, well, which was referenced by The Guardian last year when a certain story broke, which has since been challenged as being, you know, not really as robust as it might have been. And I think in that situation, I don't know the details, but it looks to me that possibly a group of people have come together and decided that they need to take you know, kind of firm action in terms of engaging with the scientific community and meeting, you know, one assertion with a similarly weighty assertion to create real counterbalance in the market. So I think that's the kind of third example, which is something which is much deeper and much kind of, you know, kind of more in depth in order to organize, but, you know, but certainly very influential in terms of bringing third parties who are experts back into the conversation to kind of shift the narrative. So not allowing an inaccuracy to stand if there is, you know, a very firm weight of opinion around the industry that in fact that was not representative of the facts. So Nigel, over to you.
Yeah, I suppose I'm thinking about the same story last year where there was criticism of the methodology that had been used to critique the standard setting body. And if you're standing to one side, you've bought one of these products and had it certified, but you're a customer, if you like, rather than the standard setting body. I suppose a good question would be, do you want to jump into the fray just because it's been mentioned in the press? Is this a fight you're going to win? And would it be better to make sure that the appropriate body is going to engage, as they did in that case, and that other scientific experts would jump in as well and their perspective? But would it actually help if you, as purchaser of these credits, express views in the press? maybe not. And it may not actually have an impact on your reputation either, a positive impact. If you do that, if you're jumping into what is currently contested territory, even if objectively speaking, it shouldn't be.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for those great questions. Thanks to the audience, and thanks to the panelists, the Willful Group, Klein & Co, and Kita. It's been a great pleasure having you all here. And we know that there's a few more questions that haven't been answered. We will do our best to address them after this call separately. Thank you very much, and have a good end of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.